everyone, I'm Elizabeth Newsom and welcome to my channel. Today I'll be doing 25 bookish facts about me. And just to give you guys a heads up, some of these facts are more related to reading while others are more related to writing. Just because I do a lot of both, and both are more or less bookish. So without further ado, here are 25 bookish facts about me. Fact number 1. When I'm reading and I read about how a character makes an expression, I like to mimic their expression to try it out for myself. It says if they purse their lips and quirk an eyebrow, I'll be staring at my book like. So as you can imagine, sometimes I get some interesting comments from my family members. And this is not only a bad habit where reading is concerned, but when I visualize any sort of story or anything imaginative in my head. Like if I'm having this conversation with people and I'm telling them a story about a previous experience, I'll act out everything and mouth the words and things like that if no one's around. So luckily not too many people have been paying attention when I do these things and when I make faces as I read, but it still kind of makes me feel weird. Number 2. Contemporary YA books kind of annoy me. It's not that I hate them or anything. I kind of like some, but they're also a bit irritating to me just because it seems the main language the teenagers use most of the time is sarcasm, and they're really blunt and they think they're much deeper and more philosophical than everyone else, which is fine and all. Philosophy is great, sarcasm is great, but for me it gets a little tedious after a while. I generally prefer other YA books than contemporary. Fact number 3. I like buying nonfiction books in print. For fiction books, it doesn't really matter, it's just whatever's convenient at the time. If it's one of my all-time favorite books, then I'll probably buy it in print. But for nonfiction books I really like, I have to buy all of them in print. Just because if I have it in print, then I get to highlight and underline and bookmark all the things I want to. It's a lot easier to interact with the material when it's physical. If I buy a book for the purpose of learning something, and it's a pretty informative book, then I will get it in print. Fact number 5 is about book genres that I just don't read. The first one is horror, or sometimes certain supernatural genres. It kind of just depends. And then I don't do erotica. If I'm reading along in a book and the main characters have premarital sex and it's portrayed as okay, then I'll drop the book, which I mentioned in an earlier video. And finally, I don't really read books with bisexual or homosexual romances. Fact number 6 is that I'm what some people might consider to be a little abusive towards books. I know a lot of people are really perfectionistic when it comes to their books. No cracked spines, no ruined covers. They like to preserve it and keep it in really pristine condition. I am not like that. For me, if I really like a book, I want to interact with it. I want to underline things. I want to highlight things. I'm going to dog-ear certain pages if I really like a quote, or if I just don't have a bookmark on hand. So to me, a well-worn book is kind of a well-loved book. And as long as it's not damaged beyond where I can read it, I'm totally fine with that. 7 is I'm a pretty fast reader. When you read on Kindle, it gives you about an average time for how long it takes people to read it. And doing a little math, it looks like I read about 18% faster. I mean, on some books I'm slower. It kind of depends on the book. For example, my goal last year in 2017 was to read at least 45 books, and I ended up reading about 66. And I know a lot of people who read way more than 66, like they're up at 102 books or something like that. I don't actually set a specific time to read. I just read whenever I have free time. So I think 66 is a pretty good number. And because I'm a fast reader, I'll probably group a lot of the books that I review together, because I know that people don't necessarily look for specific books as much as they do kind of genres, which is why I'm doing things like Wattpad royalty or books with assassins, things like that. Number 8 is that I'm a little wary of reading fiction on weekdays, just because fiction can be so addictive, and if I start a fiction book and then I have to put it down for a few hours, it feels like I'm dying every moment I'm away from the book and like I need to read it and finish it. So generally during weekdays, I'll read a fiction book that's not super addictive, or I might read some nonfiction book, because nonfiction books generally aren't as addictive. Number 9 is that a book cover alters my perception of the book. And by this, I don't only mean that I judge a book by its cover, but to make it even worse, a book cover kind of filters my perception of the book as I'm reading it. Like if it's a super professional, clean, polished cover, that will kind of change how I feel about the book in general and about the story. Whereas if it looks really cheap, it also changes kind of like the feel and the tone of book as I read it. Number 10 is that I'm a writer first and a reader second. What I mean by this is that I don't necessarily spend more time writing than reading, but if it ever comes down between the two and I have to sacrifice one for the other, it'll be my writing first. Just because for me, writing is kind of like my life mission and purpose, and writing is how I want to impact other people and reach them and just change their perception of the world. So even though for me, writing is a lot harder, and sometimes it's more fun just to read, I will always put my writing before my reading. 10. If I really like a book and I want to absorb as much information from it as possible, then it cannot be an audiobook. I'm not an audio type person. That's not how I learn and absorb information. If it's a fiction book, I never do it as an audiobook because when I read fiction, I want to fully assess how they phrase different words. I want to go over parts and reread them if I really like a scene. And audiobooks just aren't a great way to assess all of that. Now, I do listen to some nonfiction audiobooks, but if it's a somewhat decent nonfiction book, I have to have it at least on Kindle, if not in physical form. Because if I just listen to it, then I won't remember all of the information and I find that I forget a lot. 13. I don't generally switch back and forth between books, like read some of one, some of another, and go back and forth, because I like to keep the stories straight and separate in my head. Now, what I will do is sometimes I'll read a nonfiction book while I'm reading a fiction book, or I'll have a physical book I'm reading while I'm reading an ebook. This way, I get a break between nonfiction or fiction, or sometimes if I don't have my physical book on hand, I can just pull out my phone and read my ebook. Fact number 14. If someone interrupts me in the middle of a book I'm reading, it takes me about a full minute to transition to the real world before I can actually understand what they're saying. Like, I'll kind of act like I understand, like nod and go, It takes a little bit before I can understand what people are talking about. If someone casually says my name or mentions it in conversation while I'm reading, I'll snap back to the present and kind of tune into the conversation. Other than that, I'm really oblivious to the world around me when I'm reading. Like, I don't notice people coming or going or just things happening around me. Fact number 15 isn't directly related to books, but it does have to do with BookTube. And that fact is that I actually have a pretty short attention span when it comes to book review videos on BookTube, which is really, really bad because I do book review videos on BookTube. What I have to do to watch some of my favorite BookTubers' videos is I'll wear headphones and I'll listen to the video as I do other things, just because sometimes sitting and looking at a video is just not enough stimulation for me. I probably need to work on lengthening my attention span. Fact number 16 is that I have never had a single moment, book, or series where I've really gotten into reading. Ever since I could read, reading has been my choice of pastime. And I know a lot of people have this certain milestone where they read this book and it kind of revolutionized the way they saw reading. They started reading for fun, they started reading more. For me, that never really happened. I've just always liked reading. Fact number 17 is that I have contacts. Now, this is kind of loosely related again to reading, but it's related nonetheless. So in my younger years, I actually used to have better than average vision, but I read a lot of books, so eventually my vision gradually started getting worse and worse. And now I'm considered legally blind, and I absolutely have to be wearing some sort of contacts or something. I know there are some ways to kind of preserve your quality of vision, like if you take a break every now and then and look up from the book, but at the same time, it's not too bad. Contacts are great. And it's kind of like having normal vision. Fact number 18 is kind of writing related, and it's that when I was in elementary school, a lot of times I'd ask for composition notebooks. And even now I have like a shelf or two just dedicated to notebooks. Some of them are completely filled, some half filled, some are empty. And having this habit of where I have to do my thinking on physical paper has been really helpful with some of the story writing I've done. Number 19 is that some of the earliest stories I told were interactive stories. This was a game I'd made up around my preteen years. It's kind of like a role-playing game, except there's no board or no tokens or pieces involved. You just use your voice, and one person's the narrator, the rest of the people are characters, and they tell the narrator what their characters do, and the narrator tells them what happens as a result. And when I played with my friends and my family, everyone always chose me to be the narrator because they thought I was the best at telling stories. And that's how I got a lot of my storytelling practice. Fact number 20. One of my earliest story ideas was about this baby who wanted to rule the world, and he was recruiting other babies. And essentially what they were doing was they were going to attack these dentists. And this kind of stemmed from a vendetta I'd had against dentists for a while. When I was really little and I had my first dental appointment, I had 13 cavities that I had to get fillings for. And as you can imagine, that wasn't really a great experience. Fact number 21 is that the first novel-sized story I actually completed was a Jelsa fanfiction. And in case you guys don't know what Jelsa is, it's Jack Frost from Rise of the Guardians and Elsa from Frozen. And it was a duology. In total, I think I wrote about 200,000 words. I still have it up on Wattpad in fanfiction.net. I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading it because that was when I was still doing a lot of developing and writing, and I was still learning about storytelling techniques and things like that. Fact number 22 is that I really like to study book interiors. I like to look at where they put the page numbers on the page, how the chapter heading looks, whether they use numbers and chapter titles or just one or the other, and kind of just the little decorative touches that they put around the book. In a few years, I'm going to self-publish my own manuscript, and I want to make sure it looks professional, so I like going through other books for ideas on how book interiors should look. Fact number 23 is that I have never read Harry Potter or Twilight. Fact number 24 is pretty bad, and it's that sometimes I read a book purely for the romance. Like, I'll completely ignore the plot or phase out when they're talking about some mystery. I'll just read for the relationship between the two characters and not really pay attention to the rest of the book. And this is a bad habit that comes from my mid to younger teen years when I was really obsessed with romance. Reading any other genre was a complete chore, and I wouldn't even consider a book unless it had romance in it. Now, I still love romance books. But even if romance isn't one of the main themes in the book, I can still read it and enjoy it. And fact number 25 is that you probably won't see a lot of book hauls on this channel. I only buy one book at a time, and then I finish it, and then I'll buy another book. So I don't really ever buy a bunch of books all at once. Well, those are 25 bookish facts about me. I hope you guys aren't completely bored about hearing about me and books yet. And I'll be tagging the TheSarahCubittDiaries to do this book tag because I don't believe she's done it yet. And I'll link her down below so you guys can check out her channel. Sarah is really fun. She has a lot of enthusiasm, and in the future we'll be working together. And I'd like to know your thoughts on this video. What are your answers to some of these questions, and what did you think about my answers? Are there any you can kind of relate to? Let me know down below, and I will see you next time.